I am going to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Dr. Dylan Rudiger. He's a program manager for research enterprise at Ithaka S+R, where he leads a team by helping universities, funders, lawmakers, and scholars develop evidence-based responses to shape the production and circulation of scholarly knowledge. We also have Dr. Claire Bytash. She's an analyst at Ithaka S+R who focuses on the academic research enterprise. And I should also include that they have given this presentation a few times, and they told me they're getting better and better and better. And so I think we're in store for a lot of knowledge today. So with that, I will turn it over to Claire and Dylan. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah, for immediately raising the bar on us. That's great.
You're welcome.
Hopefully we can clear that today. It's really nice to be here, and I'm really appreciative of Sarah giving us the opportunity to come and speak to everyone today. As she mentioned, my name is Dylan Rudiger, and I am a program manager at an organization called Ithaka S+R. Some of you may or may not be sorry. What is wrong? Excuse me for a sec. There we go. Technical difficulties. My partner here today is Claire Bytash. Together, we'll be walking you through some projects that we are developing in the AI space, including a large collaborative research project that we're conducting over the next couple of years, and some observations that we've developed from talking to faculty, staff, senior administrators, librarians, people from centers in teaching and learning across higher education about what's going on in the generative AI landscape in higher ed now and in the future. Some of you may or may not be familiar with our organization, so just very briefly, I'll say that Ithaka S+R is a not-for-profit research organization that's part of a larger organization that includes JSTOR, which I suspect many people are familiar with, as it's one of the earliest large databases of digitized journal articles, and still a leader in that space. Our part of the shop at S+R specifically, and if you're wondering, the S stands for strategy, the R stands for research. We conduct large-scale applied research projects that help academic and cultural institutes navigate change. And over time, we've tended to focus a lot of our attention on the intersections of information practices and technology. The bulk of the work that we do is funded through grants, but we also do some fee-for-service work as well. One of the distinguishing features of the research methods that we use is that we typically collaborate with universities to help us operate at a very large scale of research. And by large, I really want to say that I mean large. The stats that you see on your screen are for one program area inside the research enterprise portfolio that focuses on research and teaching support services. And as you can see, over the past decade or so, we have conducted a very large number of interviews with faculty from a very large number of places that range from community colleges to R1s and range geographically from the US to Canada to the EU. And we also run a triennial survey of faculty that has received almost 40,000 responses. We've been fielding that now for about 20 years. So we have really good longitudinal data about teaching and research practices across disciplines that we've gathered from both quantitative and qualitative means over time, which helps us to really understand when something new emerges on the scene, how it compares to what happens before, and gives us a kind of a rich context for understanding what's happening now. Just to give you a quick agenda here about the order for operations today, I'm going to turn things over to Claire momentarily. She is going to give an overview of the current generative AI project that we're working on and share a few more details about what that looks like and what we're hoping to learn from that. We'll also share some key findings to date from that project and offer some suggestions about where we think the future areas of emphasis might be over the next couple of academic years. We're going to try to leave at least 20 minutes for question and answer, and I will personally say that the discussion is always my favorite part of these conversations. Claire, I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right, so Next slide. Yeah, so making AI generative for higher education is the title of our project. This is a multi-institutional applied research project. We're doing it in partnership with 19 institutions in the US and Canada. Next slide. So first, a little bit on how generative AI is affecting universities, generally speaking. So AI tools have existed for some time. They've been on the radar of universities for some time, but the release of ChatGPT in 2022 changed things and made the issue much more of an urgent priority. Now these mass market generative AI tools like ChatGPT can create new content, and as a result, they intersect more directly with the core teaching, learning, and research missions of universities, as we have written here on the slide that you see. So essentially, this technology will affect all aspects of the university. It will create opportunities for different aspects of university life and challenges as well. And here under the key areas of impact, we have three, I guess, three ways in which AI will create these opportunities and challenges. The first one for students, teaching and learning context, then for faculty and research, and then staffing. So I'll just go through them quickly. The first one, generative AI poses pedagogical and cognitive questions about the role of writing in student learning and the nature of academic honesty, probably the topic you've heard the most about at this point in relation to generative AI. Then faculty can accelerate the research process through the use of generative AI, while the tool also raises questions about research ethics. And then third, we have staff. So staff tasks may become more efficient, but staff may feel vulnerable to displacement. Existing units may become obsolete or undergo radical transformation. New units may emerge. And then there are other, these were some of the challenges came up in these 3 points, and there are other challenges that may affect some or all of these groups related to data privacy, equitable access, or algorithmic bias. So next slide. So this slide is just taking a moment to pause to think about what generative AI is and why it's different, some of the forms of AI to other forms of AI. So generative artificial intelligence describes algorithms like ChatGPT being the most famous that can be used to create new content. This can be text, images, audio code, simulations, videos. And Gen AI does this by the patterns it learns from the data it's trained with. And recent breakthroughs in this field of generative AI, as we're all experiencing, have the potential to drastically change the way we approach content creation. So next slide. Why are these changes so important? So 2 points to highlight here. Number one, generative AI reflects a shift away from extractive AI. So while generative AI has outputs that create something new, extractive AI was more about being able to find the most relevant information from the data set that the AI was trained on. And then the second point we have here is that now these are mass market tools, which means that AI is not restricted to specific users who are experts or specialized use. It is now accessible to all members of university communities, which changes the playing field as well. Next slide. So back to our project, making AI generative for higher education. So what we are doing is we're bringing together this community of 19 universities for this 2-year project to develop evidence-based strategies for proactive engagement with generative AI tools. So working with us, our cohort are going to assess the immediate and emerging AI applications, most likely to disrupt teaching, learning, and research, create new strategies, policies, and programs to ensure they're ready for this technology. And then here under the key project components, we have the 3 key methodologies we're using, which I'll also go through briefly. So first we have iterative research to provide up-to-date data about best practices, policies, and products. qualitative inquiry into emerging norms, practices, and support needs across a range of disciplines, and then knowledge sharing, consulting and co-learning to develop responsive policies and resources. So this is just a list of all the schools that are working with us in our first cohort. We're really excited by the diversity of institutions in this project because it provides a good sample of institutions in the US that are active in both teaching and research. And then we also have 3 Canadian institutions, which are going to provide an interesting comparative perspective. So here we have the project milestones broken down into 4 phases, which I'll just explain briefly. So phase 1, which is what we're launching this fall, the campus and landscape assessment. So under each phase, we have what our cohort are going to be working on and what we in S+R are going to be working on at the same time. So the participating schools are going to be assessing AI readiness among their faculty. In the meantime, we're working on a landscape review of policy and product developments, which we're going to keep updating over the course of the project as the technology in the scene is rapidly changing. Then the next phase, which will be in the spring, our participating schools are going to be conducting interviews with their faculty to understand how they're using generative AI and what their needs are. We're going to be analyzing that interview data and conducting supplementary interviews. Then we get to phase 3, which is more about designing the support services the schools want to implement. So the participating schools at this point are going to be identifying areas for intervention for the projects they want to pilot. And we're going to lead design workshops to develop those pilot projects in response to the goals that the institutions are coming up with. And then the final phase, stakeholder engagement. At this point, the schools are going to be implementing their pilot projects with stakeholders. We're going to be supporting them during that implementation process, and we'll also be publishing our findings to the public. So about the one more thing on that slide, just about the support services themselves. We don't know yet what the institutions are going to choose to do, but we anticipate there'll be things like creating a university-wide AI policy, policies for units, AI boot camps for faculty, AI literacy orientation for students, creating equity around faculty AI policies, legal and financial risk assessment, and the list could go on, but I'll leave it there and I'll turn it back over to you, Dylan.
Thanks, Claire. So as we've put this cohort together and as we've worked on keeping an ear out for what other institutions in and outside the cohort are thinking about, we've really been talking to a lot of people around higher education and from lots of different parts of a university, which makes sense since this is an issue that is so broad in its potential impacts that you're not going to be able to see the whole if you're just looking at 1 or 2 parts in the institution. Just on the team of institutions that we have in the cohort, we've asked each of them to put together a local research team to do the work on campus. Their teams include librarians, people from IT or CIOs, folks from centers for teaching and learning, faculty from departments as far apart as music and engineering, vice provosts for research, people in tech transfer offices. So even though our deliverables for this project are often focused on relatively small scale interventions that are targeted to key strategic areas, we're continually informing them by larger conversations about how any given action fits within the larger context of a university, its strategic priorities, and its mission. We're already beginning to learn some things, which is great. The project is really in its early stages. We just had our official kickoff meeting last week, but these conversations have been going on all year. So we've been learning already, and we expect to continue to do so. And as Claire mentioned, we will periodically publish results and findings so that other institutions that aren't in the cohort have the opportunities to learn from what we're doing. I wanted to highlight briefly a couple of key trends that we've seen over the spring and at the beginning of the fall semester that are kind of a big picture, high level findings for what's going on across the landscape. The first one is really that to date, much of the institutional energy has gone into treating generative AI as a problem related to teaching and learning. This makes a lot of sense. It accords very well with public discourse about the technology, which particularly in the spring was very focused on cheating, catching students, kind of prohibitive or punishment-based approaches to generative AI. And even as we're beginning to see institutions shift into a more of a focus on pedagogical implications and best practices, we continue to see that even institutions that are very large research institutions, which you might expect would not be quite as honed in on teaching and learning, that's the first lens that they're seeing this issue through. My expectation is that that will change somewhat over time, but it gives you a good sense of where other institutions are starting from. Where we have also noted that to date there is not all that much policy to help instructors navigate classrooms, and even less to help researchers understand how to use the technology correctly. As you can see on the screen, only about 20% of institutions had policies related to ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI at the beginning of the spring or in the middle of the spring semester. That's changed quite a bit. We don't have updated numbers, but obviously every day we're starting to see more and more institutions that are rolling things like that out. I think the biggest thing that is notable to me when I look at those policies is how many of them are really going all in on a pretty decentralized approach. You see this in teaching and learning in particular, where many policy statements essentially amount to individual faculty having latitude to make decisions about whether and how they might incorporate this technology. And in the research space, we're seeing a pretty similar emphasis on publishers as people who are deciding what the ethics and proper use cases for generative AI are in that sphere. Universities have not yet en masse figured out institution-wide strategies for handling this, and so they're leaving a lot of the decision making to smaller units. In the teaching case, that has a lot to do with faculty autonomy and other issues, but I would anticipate that we're going to start seeing more systematic policy statements or best practices and guidelines coming out over the next academic year or two. And the third thing that we've seen, particularly this summer, is that now that generative AI is a thing and the hot buzzword that everybody wants to talk about, you're seeing all kinds of new products being launched that are going to be sold to either universities on a kind of enterprise level or to faculties and students inside universities. Some of these are pretty interesting tools. Some of them are just slapping the word generative AI on top of something that already exists. And it's been very difficult for many of the schools we're talking with to sort through the quality of these tools, to assess which ones are worth their while, and to understand the legal, political implications of making choices about which products to support on campus. Looking a little bit ahead now, and this is a fairly short term, maybe couple year horizon. It's hard to see beyond that. But I think it's very safe to say that the kind of volatility and conditions of uncertainty that we've seen in the spring semester are likely to continue to be an important factor in how institutions are making decisions around generative AI. The plain fact of the matter is that the technology and the tools are evolving and spreading much more quickly than universities are able to react, or legal systems are able to react, and certainly then, say, Congress is able to react. And so universities are in an interesting position of having to make decisions now without being able to be clear about what, say, the legal or the financial implications of those decisions are going to be. And that, I think, will be the case for a while. I mentioned earlier that we're already starting to see a shift away from an emphasis on cheating and prohibiting use, punishing people who are using this tool, and towards what I think are ultimately more productive questions about when and how generative AI can be an important pedagogical tool, what that looks like, what it means in terms of how we assess whether learning is happening in a larger frame, what it means to learn or to be educated. And those conversations are really starting to take center stage as we look into the fall semester. There hasn't been a lot of work yet done on how those will intersect with disciplinary traditions, disciplinary ways of knowing, disciplinary specific standards for what kinds of outputs are valued. That's a space that I think there's a lot of opportunity for future thinking about and will be really important, because even though this is a tool that has wide use cases, it's not necessarily one that is well suited to be used in identical ways across the various departments and disciplines that make up a university. And the last point that I think we're just beginning to see is universities picking up a little bit more interest in understanding how this is going to impact the research enterprise at their institution. And I think there's still a real opportunity here for institutions that want to devote a lot of attention here, given how much research prowess and dollars are the coin of the realm at research universities. It seems to me there's a pretty big opportunity for people that want to make this pivot earlier rather than later. By way of conclusion, just a couple of final thoughts, also oriented towards the kind of boundary between the right now and the future. It's become really clear to me over the summer how difficult it is to really know where we are on the hype cycle of this kind of product. This is one of the uncertainties that universities are going to have to make do in. There are a lot of really powerful uses of generative AI that are being developed all the time, and that have clear applications in higher ed. But there's also, I think, a laudable and growing awareness of the difference between a tool that can generate new text and the idea of a tool as something that can generate new thought. And I think universities are starting to think very carefully about that distinction, and that will be one of the key things that ends up mattering, particularly as we start articulating new sets of pedagogical goals or ways of assessment, will often revolve, I think, around that distinction. The other thing that I see on the maybe longer term horizon is that right now, we're still kind of in the market share place in terms of the commercial aspects of the technology. People are much more interested right now in gaining users than in making money. At some point, that is likely to shift, and the finances of the tool are actually pretty effectively hidden right now, but they're very large. As I imagine many of you know, Microsoft has already invested billions of dollars just to train the tool. And a recent piece that I read in the Washington Post mentioned that ChatGPT, OpenAI were losing almost $1 million a day on searches. As the number of searchers grow, that number will likely increase, even with some economies of scale. And I think that what that means for universities is to understand that as they're making decisions about how much they want to go all in on generative AI, it's important to recognize that even though the tools are free now, that is likely to change going forward, and it could potentially have very significant financial impacts. It may also have impacts about equity. I know this is a consortial group of higher ed. As the tool becomes more of a paid tool, there's a pretty strong likelihood that the publicly available versions of the software will be less capable than what you can get by subscription. That's already the case and will likely continue. And it'll probably contribute to existing academic hierarchies and financial realities that give some students and some faculty greater access to things than others. So that's another thing that I would really I really think is going to become a larger part of the conversation over the next couple of years. The last thing I'll say, and then we'll open this up to discussion, is that besides the current cohort that we're working on that Claire described, we're also this spring about to launch a faculty survey of instructional practices. And this new survey will have a pretty significant emphasis on how instructors are adopting and using generative AI in the classroom. We will be making the data that we gain from this publicly available later in 2024. And if you're interested in reading what we learn, it'll be freely available probably in the summer. If you're interested in potentially being a partner on that project, please let us know. And more broadly, if anyone has any interest in just sharing news and gossip about what's going on around generative AI, we learn a lot from doing that, and I hope it's clear that we have something to share as well. So I will leave it there. I think we've put some issues on the table that hopefully will be of some interest, and I'd love to hear what people are thinking and what questions you might have for us. Sarah, do you want me to call on people on my own?
Sure. Michael, do you want to go?
Yeah, I noticed in the list of the universities in your cohort, a couple that have professional schools. I teach paralegal studies at Tulsa Community College, and I was wondering if, say, for instance, say at Yale, if the law school is involved in that study.
Yeah, so at Yale, no. However, the University of Arizona joined the project under the leadership of the law school, which is particularly interested in the topic of legal education and generative AI. They're the only school in the cohort that's really squarely centered on that problem. And maybe, as you know, since you're in the field, they also announced earlier this week at Arizona that they're going to be hosting a series of roundtable discussions about generative AI and its implications for law libraries specifically that are going to be held over the next academic year. Those look like they're going to be really interesting and maybe are a way to follow the conversation in that discipline-specific context. More broadly speaking, there are several other institutions that have pretty significant involvement from, say, the business school. And so while not everyone in the cohort is really focused on professional schools, they're definitely in the mix of what we anticipate learning about over the course of the project.
I can say that I can only speak to my discipline, but it was very disruptive very quickly. And not just in the form of, say, the andragogical concern with respect to academic honesty, but it's actually resulted in some significant transactions and consolidations among some of the service providers in the industry, and some of the tools that are anticipated to come online as shortly as November of this year are going to change the nature of the labor market and thus have an impact on legal education in terms of the types of skills and also the types of degrees that are going to be more in demand and less in demand.
Yeah, that strikes me as a very very clear assessment of what's likely to happen, not only in law schools, but and not only even in professional schools, but really in a lot of departments across the university are going to be having to figure out some combination of those factors that you just described. So yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Christina, do you have a question?
I do. So I am a librarian from Emerson College, and I'm just curious to know, like, how are you involving students in some of these studies in terms of not so much what are students doing, but like what are students' opinions? At Emerson, we have a number of different creative majors. Probably our film program is our biggest. And the thing that I find really interesting at the library is that our faculty are very reactive, and they're very much part of the group of people that are like, oh, people are going to use this to cheat on their essays. But when we talk to like film students are like adamantly like, no, we would never use AI. That defeats the whole purpose of being creative. And they're obviously well aware of like, the AI implications with the current SAG-AFTRA strike and things like that. So I'm just curious, are you doing anything in terms of getting like student input on AI?
Yeah, so I think Claire can speak quite a bit to what we're learning about students and maybe the different ways that students see some of these things relative to faculty. I'll say, though, before I turn it over to her, that our cohort project that we're doing right now is focused on faculty support needs. So we'll be interviewing faculty. Part of this is we're trying to find the people who have teaching and research responsibilities at a university so that we can look at both. But I also, having said that, anticipate that many of these interventions that institutions are going to design over the course of the project will be directed at either developing instruments to understand how students are feeling about or using the technology, or otherwise focused on learning, whereas much of our project is focused on teaching. So I do anticipate we'll see some of that, but it's hard to know exactly how yet. And Claire, do you have anything to add about the bigger picture?
Yeah, I was going to say a few things, maybe bigger picture on how this whole conversation is including or not including students. But I think you're right, and I saw that in many quarters, people saying that student perspectives weren't heard enough, especially during the first few months last spring. I think in the last few months that's starting to pick up. We're seeing more and more pieces written by students or circulated by students. There was a major conference on AI in education organized by students, mainly at the University of Illinois, that took place online and had a lot of big speakers this summer. And one of their big missions was to put the student voice out there. And I also think that some campuses that are trying to assess the community are starting to include students in those assessments to figure out what students are doing with the tools, what they think about it. And things are coming out like that. Students, while they may have a higher rate of adoption than faculty, though even that is varied, they also see the academic integrity concerns like faculty do. There are also some sort of differences, though, in the use cases for students. They see it as students often are reporting that they see it as a way to save time, sometimes on tasks that they say are just administrative tasks, that I could save time on this by using a generative AI tool, and then as a result, I can do more critical thinking. So I think it brings up this bigger question that needs to be addressed between instructors and students and librarians too, as to what is critical thinking, what is at the center of learning and education. But I also don't want to paint a big picture of what students are saying. So I think I'm realizing more and more as student perspectives are coming out is that they're varied. It's not all that they're determined to use it to cheat. It's not all that they are super focused on academic integrity. It's not all that they're using it all the time or not. There is variation. So I hope that helps to address a little the sort of landscape of how students are being looked at.
I think one final thought on that. There has been some evidence emerging. Mark Watkins at the University of Mississippi, for example, and a study done earlier this year at Texas A&M that included students as part of their survey respondents, that kind of backs up what you were saying, Christina, insofar as it suggests that students are more cautious about their engagement with the technology than popular conventional wisdom might suggest, and that they recognize the kind of trade-offs of using it, like Claire was discussing about. They're at least thinking about when and how it makes sense for them to use the tool. Whether they're making the right judgment calls or not is a different question, but they're cognizant of those issues. And I guess the final thing too is that there have been a couple of those studies at the University of Virginia and Michigan and TMU, most notably, TAMU, that suggest that students and faculty are actually, broadly speaking, aligned on their understanding of what the tool's capabilities are, and in particular about the risks that are associated with the technology. I've been fascinated to discover that students are essentially as likely as faculty to consider the possibility of dis and misinformation as like the major concern with the new tool. And that to me is a really, really interesting and important finding that bodes well, I think, for the idea that people can think critically about this tool even as they're adopting and using it in all kinds of ways.
I have a quick question. I'm in addition to being with the Tulsa Higher Education Consortium, I am a professor and teach a few classes at a local university. And this is just my experience, I've encountered that people either love it and are so excited about it, or they hate it and are very nervous about it, which I think you kind of touched on in the presentation. But I'm curious, as you've engaged, and I know you're in the very beginning stages of this collaborative research endeavor, but what types of professional development supports are you seeing that colleges and universities are providing to their faculty to help assuage some of those fears or help them feel more competent so that those fears and that trust level can increase? Maybe not
Claire,
trust, but less fear.
Claire, do you want to take this one?
Sure, yeah. So I would say the main thing that popped up first were resource pages of websites. This is maybe the first sort of reaction from a lot of universities, was to create a website with a list of resources, links, information, etc. Then now more recently, I'm starting to see a bit more than that. Like, we've been keeping track of universities that are now starting to put forward training sessions for university. I was just seeing one that's going to start in October at one university, another university that's put training modules on where they had professors record videos, or the team of professors record videos for their community that are now online, and the faculty are encouraged to look into. So, and all of these, I would say that we've been keeping track of so far are mostly focused on the teaching and learning. There's also the question of how are faculty dealing with this in the research sphere. And I think there's less support, at least coming from universities or guidelines from universities on that kind of thing. So, and I would say on the sort of spectrum, all this is a little bit, maybe not quite your question, but on the spectrum of excitement and nervousness, something that we've been seeing too is that there's a general acceptance, I guess. I don't know if not excitement, but acceptance that these tools are here from faculty and they're going to have to use them, coupled with a feeling of I'm not ready to use them. And I think that's something that across the readiness assessments that are publicly available that we've been looking at that different universities have conducted, that's kind of one of the main findings that's coming out. So yeah, I don't know, Dylan, do you want to add anything to that? That was sort of what I was thinking for that.
No, I think I don't have anything substantive to add to that.
Any other questions or comments or points of discussion?
I have a question about AI in healthcare. Can you speak to that just generally? I'm in the beginning stages of learning about AI. I teach nursing. I'm interested in how it will have implications will have in our curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm would love to hear you speak to that.
Sure. And as it happens, Janet, my spouse teaches in the School of Nursing and is a huge ChatGPT generative AI fan. So this will be sample size of one mostly, but I do have some things to share about that. I think broadly speaking, there is a really interesting tension right now around whether it's appropriate to use a tool like ChatGPT for something like differential diagnosis. This is the kind of thing that actually, in theory, an LLM is well suited to do. And yet it's as good an example as you could ever find of like where the ethics of human to human versus machine to human interactions lie. And so it's been a very kind of controversial topic in the field of biomedicine and health fields, generally speaking. I don't think that tension is going to go away anytime soon. And it will be very interesting to see how folks, not nurses typically, but clinicians who are doing things like diagnosing patients, where the dust settles on those kind of questions. In nursing specifically, I'll just share one really concrete example. As you know, but maybe not everyone else in the room knows, nursing's a pretty highly regulated field. The professional association has a very well articulated, lengthy, and strict set of learning outcomes that everybody who's graduating with a nursing degree needs to be able to meet, and a pretty elaborate process for understanding how a program is achieving that objective. And the curriculum is obviously where a lot of that work happens. And one of the things that my spouse has done is she has been able to use ChatGPT to help map where the different learning outcomes are or are not being met across not only her syllabi, but other syllabi as well, which is something that can be done by people, but is much easier to do through ChatGPT, and has given her a pretty good sense of what areas they're doing particularly well on, where things maybe need some improvement, and also as they look to accreditation about how to, on a very granular level, line up specific assignments, specific class sessions with specific learning outcomes in a way that, with some human help at the end, can be a pretty comprehensive and well-organized output that would be pretty time consuming and difficult for one individual to do on their own. So I don't know how directly that answers your question, but it's a pretty, to me, it's a pretty interesting application that may have use cases in other fields that have similar levels of regulation by professional associations, maybe Michael, law schools, for example.
Thank you. I've seen online, I have not done it myself, but ChatGPT writing test questions for nursing, like giving, I've seen where educators are using it to do things like that, because in the rigor of our test banks are available, students can obtain them. It's difficult to maintain. So creating unique questions for each test using ChatGPT is one thing that I've seen out there, that I'm on groups with other educators that I see some of them using it for.
How do you feel, if I can ask you a question, how do you feel about that practice?
About creating test questions with ChatGPT? I don't know. I guess that would be the answer. I don't know yet. Viscerally, you have to look, maybe using it as the beginning of a question or like an idea, and then building off of that. That's what I would probably use it. That's my quick answer. I haven't really given it, some deep thought, but and it's all interesting. Yes. Thank you.
Yep.
I think it's also great that your wife teaches nursing, because you have insight into what we do, and the accrediting the thing.
Oh, I know. I mean, from an outsider's perspective, I know all about it.
You probably know more than what you want to know.
that may or may not be. This is being recorded, so I will just say that I plead the fifth.
Okay.
We do have a question in the chat. I'll read it. Well, obviously the speed of adoption is different. Have you seen any lessons learned during the early aughts of the impact of the internet and classical search engines that institutions are already effectively applying?
That is a really good question.
Beautifully written, I might add, Steve.
Yes. And I think one of the things that's slightly different about either the internet in general or search engines as a part of that broader technological transformation and the way ChatGPT has kind of sprung up is the speed and rapidity with which the technology is becoming adopted. I was in school. I'm embarrassed to say I was an undergraduate when there were still web crawlers, the old ones pre-Google, and had the opportunity to witness the kind of uneven pace at which faculty could and did just ignore that this technology existed for quite some time. I don't know of any places that have done particularly well at this, but I will say that as far as search engines go, this is probably the place where we're going to see the first big wave of products that are going to be directed primarily at libraries, because even though ChatGPT is quite prolific at making up citations, generative AI tools in general are really powerful tools for discovery, which of course is a really fundamental part of learning and of research. And all the major publishers, all the players in the industry are trying to figure out how to integrate this new tool into the discovery process. I guess I would say, if anything, that maybe what we can learn from the internet and Google is that just because certain kinds of knowledge become the barrier to getting them becomes lower, doesn't necessarily mean that you're cheapening the process of finding the information. And it creates opportunities to actually accelerate what people are able to learn because it becomes so much easier to have access to that information. I know that's not quite what you asked, but that's, I think, I don't know, Claire, do you have a more specific answer to that question?
No, I don't think I have anything that would be really as in-depth to add as what you just said. I would agree.
Michael, did you have something to add?
For my discipline, there was over the summer, and this is probably fairly widely seen, news about attorneys who made the mistake of filing briefs written entirely by generative AI, only to discover they had been unaware that generative AI has a problem with hallucination with respect to facts generally and the law specifically. And so I've already seen, not at the institutional level, but colleagues across the country advising their students that those tools are not yet trustworthy in that respect, but that in very short time they will be, as they become connected to the behind the paywall proprietary databases from the legal research providers. So the industry was always amenable to adopting any technology that improves efficiency. But I anticipate that what you will find from your research that touches upon legal education is that we are abundantly aware of the limitations of the free resources available, specifically with respect to the phenomenon of hallucination. But we're leaning into the use of the tools because they are being brought to bear, frankly, without input, without significant input from institutions of higher ed. There are just too many economic efficiencies to be achieved and thus money to be made. So we have to play, not catch up, but embracing and going along for the ride, much more like, riding writing a bull.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, we're on for the ride, and it's going to hurt a few times, but you know, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and this is only so related, Michael, but I mentioned in some of the prepared remarks the difference between a tool that can create new text and a tool that can create new thought. And your comments just now reminded me of a conversation that I had with one of our lawyers just earlier this week. And Ithaka has been experimenting with some new tools that are on the market that are designed to help gather precedents and other kinds of information from the legal corpus and assist attorneys in decision making around how they want to approach given topics. And one of the things that she was talking about quite a bit was that the tool is really good at finding precedents for things. It's a baby LLM in that it's trained on a specific defined corpus of just law, case law, but that it was really terrible at interpreting what the various precedents meant and how to weigh conflicting precedents against each other, how to distinguish why one thing may or may not actually apply. I think you're correct to point out that the tools may become increasingly efficient at doing things like that. And I will say I am not a programmer, but it also seems to me that one of the open questions is how, for a technology that's fundamentally about, I mean, this is a cruel way to put it, but about reorganizing words that it's seen before, how much better will it get at that interpretation process? Because the machine has no, there's nothing in the programming that's actually designed to create any kind of understanding. And so it's conceivable that we may end up with a tool that's really useful for things like gathering precedent or understanding discovery, but not very useful at helping to make sense of what's going on. I don't know how many of you have played around with ChatGPT yourselves, but that certainly has been my experience. It's really good at giving you a kind of conventional wisdom. It's really good at reorganizing words. But I'm not sure, especially with the big LLMs, okay, you've got 20 billion words in them or whatever it is. What's the gain from another 10 billion words? My guess is very, very little, actually. And I don't know how else the technology gets better. But again,
there's been
not a programmer.
From two different disciplines, there have been two insights into that. One of them goes to the idea that generative AI doesn't produce new thought, and I agree. But what it does is permit you to see patterns that you didn't see before because of the scale. But what it's particularly bad at, and these are primarily coming from these thoughts I'm reporting here, not mine. They're primarily coming from philosophers of mind and the associated disciplines and the cognitive disciplines. The very architecture of binary computing, or even 10-base computing, any computing that relies upon a monotonic operator does not allow for considering counterfactuals. They're terrible at counterfactuals. And in my discipline, what we call issue spotting, being able to recognize facts that give rise to the creation or tension between rights and obligations among citizens, is what we call issue spotting. And you have to contemplate facts that you don't presently have and consider alternative explanations. A lot of abductive reasoning going on that leads to inductive reasoning. Very little way in deductive reasoning. That I think is going to be a barrier we overcome, but we could be decades or centuries away from that, depending on what we do, not only with respect to the underlying hardware, but the underlying programming languages. I don't think until we introduce modal logics into the programming languages that we'll be able to take advantage of the coming changes to the hardware to achieve new thought, wherein the tools can handle counterfactuals, and thus humans will be needed for the foreseeable future to do just that.
I know
That's one nerd's insight.
We're starting to run short on time, but I did want to toss one question out to the group, and we've kind of talked around it. Janet gave some good examples, but has anyone else on this call used generative AI just to help with your normal day-to-day tasks? So Janet used the example of test questions, help prompt ideas. Are there any other ways that it's been used, that for the good or the bad, it didn't go well, that you could share?
I didn't submit it, but performance evaluations are contentious at my institution. And so a couple of colleagues and I basically used it to write the self-evaluation because we just didn't want to do it. But we ended up doing it, but it was like just to do it to see if ChatGPT could write something. And it did a really good job. It was basically like, I could have submitted this and probably, you know, it would have read like I wrote my own evaluation, but
I've used it for student evaluations in certain types of lessons wherein I have the student restate the question and then answer the question. It allows me to give a much more in-depth evaluation, something that might take me a half hour per student. There's not enough hours in the day to be able to give that kind of detail. And so, you know, I'll upload a question and get an evaluation. And it's about 85% of it it's right on the money. And then I can edit it and give a student much more in-depth feedback.
And some in the chat are student evaluations, editing tools, research processes, developing faculty workshops. That is one that's very interesting to me, developing workshops. I'll have to test that one moving forward. Anything else before we move to closing out today? Okay, well, I thank you all for being here, and I also sincerely thank Dr. Rudiger and Dr. Baitas for being here. If you have not, drop your email in the chat. That way I can pull it and follow up with you. And I will also include our presenters on that email. So if you have extra burning questions, you will have their contact information and be able to follow their research process as it moves forward. Will that be available on your website, or where should
Yes. Anything we publish will go up on our website. And in the meantime, a pretty substantial part of our jobs are to keep an ear on what's going on in various places in higher ed. So if you just want to talk, that's always really useful for us, and we're very happy to share what we're learning and to learn more from what you're learning as well.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.